let's talk about racism. Many believe that. I'm sorry, do you want to skip tutorials? Yes. Okay, many people believe that racism can be affected by everyone, but that's not necessarily the case. So let's look at the root word of racism, which is ism. It says here a distinctive doctrine, cause, or theory. And definition two says an oppressive and especially discriminatory attitude or belief. Now let's take a look at a few more definitions. Active practices, act, practice, process. Now, manner of action or behavior, not really relevant. But now let's get prejudice or discrimination on the basis of a specified attribute, like racism or sexism. Okay. Now let's also take a deeper look. Adherence to a system or a class of principle. Okay. And if we were to go to the ordinary Oxford Dictionary, it says a distinctive practice, system, or philosophy, typically an ideology, political ideology of an artistic movement. Now let's look up the definition of racism itself: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority over a particular race. I also believe attitudes that reflect on the false they believe. Yeah. Just showing this yourself so you guys won't say I'm spreading misinformation. But let's look at definition 2A: the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage over another. Now, you want to see more? Here's some more. Pause to read if you need to. So we can say that racism has two definitions, but we can't just use whatever definition we want to. So, racial prejudice. Let's talk about that as well. Oh my gosh, what the fuck? So we have the root word of ism, which is a practice or something involving the system. And before everyone says I made that up, here you go. Dictionary.com. Yes, it is reliable. A distinctive doctrine, theory, system, or practice. Many argue that we black people cannot be racist, but we can practice racial prejudice, ethnic hatred, inner ethnic hatred, basically hate, which can go to discrimination on another race simply because of the race. And not just hate, negative practice or negative attitude and feelings anyway whatsoever. Merriam-Webster here says prejudice against or hostility towards people of another race or color or of an alien culture. So now we have this racial prejudice against a race or different culture simply because of their color or culture. Now, if this is enough to convince you guys that only black people or other minorities, especially in America, or to me, mainly in America, cannot experience racism, then let's take a look at some sites. And most important, or to be more specific, that white people in America cannot experience the same type of racism as minorities in America do. Here we have The Economist. Can white people experience racism? Accusations of reverse racism haunt an American professor. Okay. Pause to read. Eventually, we will get to somewhere that really caught my attention. All right. Let's look at here. People point out that the fundamental point that people on the left make is that stereotyping white people is not as stereotyping black people, Asian people, Muslims, immigrants, and so on. Keep that in mind. Remember this here. Remember this part because this is really important. Okay, I just went to another article by Natalie Morris. Let's take a look at her. Lifestyle deputy editor, writing on race, identity, mental health, and culture. Yada yada. Okay, now let's go back to the link of the article she wrote. its most simplistic definition, racism is prejudice discrimination directed at someone of a different race based on the belief that your own race is superior. Now, taking that definition, yeah, but look here. But this definition of racism leaves out one crucial element, the power structure that upholds and perpetuates racism. No. Here she also said racism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within a hierarchical structure with power at its core. Racism only works because one group has power and other groups do not. It is white people who historically and in the West at least hold the power when it comes to racial divides, thanks to centuries of Eurocentric beliefs and structures that continue to privilege and centralize whiteness. Now, I have a question to everyone that doesn't deny, or the question to everyone that doesn't believe in white privilege or systemic racism or anything like that. Let me ask you something. Let's talk about black people predominantly being in poor neighborhoods because the poor schools in poor neighborhoods aren't as funded as many others in mediocre neighborhoods. They are at a lower education level because of that. And who takes up the majority of those? That's right, black people. Black people are the majority in poor neighborhoods. And because of that, the school in those poor neighborhoods aren't as funded. And because of that, they don't get as good as an education system as many others. Let's take a look at this article by Health Affairs. Systemic and structural racism definitions, examples, health damages, and approaches to dismantling. Now, pause to read. Now, look at this. Systemic racism is so embedded in the system that it often is assumed to reflect the natural and inevitable order of things. Does it? Let's see. Let's see. Pause to read. Now, let's look at some examples. Political disempowerment. Political disenfranchisement and disempowerment through voter suppression and gerrymandering are an important historical and contemporary manifestation of systemic racism. The legal right for all men to vote was secured in 1870 during the nearly 100-year era of Jim Crow laws. However, voter suppression of black people was maintained in many states through violent intimidation and selectively applied laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and not eliminate requirements that continue to differently affect people of color. Even in 2021, many states recently passed or were considering legislations disproportionately restricted the voting rights of people of color, including by gerrymandering the deliberate redrawing of electoral district boundaries to favor the political party in power. Gerrymandering makes some people's votes count less than others do, depriving them of full representation. Yeah, like the rules that they passed after Trump lost the election, because to ensure that fraud ever happened in some states, I think it was Nevada, I'm not quite sure, but the laws they were passing would disproportionately affect people of color because they believe that if it affects people of color, like keeping people of color from voting would get them to win in their favor. And by win in their favor, I mean get the people that set those laws that to keep people of color under power or out of power. It would keep them from voting to therefore put the votes. Sorry, I was focused on my cat so I couldn't speak clearly. Basically, the new legislations, the laws they were passing in 2021 after Trump lost, those laws would disproportionately affect black people and many other people of color. And because of that, they would now be more in favor of conservatives. And because black people mostly vote in Democratic, those laws would prevent more black people from voting just to tip the favors of the Conservative Party. That's what I'm saying. But let's say we go by the simple definition of racism, the Oxford Dictionary, which says that it's typically against what minorities or other marginalized groups, but not only. So meaning white people can experience too. Let's say that is true. So now I have a question for white people. What racism have you experienced? Like, what racism have you experienced that could compare to black people, Native American, and many other people of color? What mass influential of hate crime? What mass influential bias and hate have you experienced simply because of your hate? And people have acted on that on a mass scale.